Welcome to Pages from History. Today we journey to the spring of 1453 to witness the end of an empire that ruled for over 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople stands as one of history's most dramatic moments, a 53-day siege that changed the world forever. Imagine walls that had never fallen, suddenly breached by weapons the world had never seen. Picture an emperor who refused to flee, choosing death over dishonor. This should have been impossible. The Queen of Cities, protected by God himself, according to legend, defended by walls that had stood for a millennium. Yet on the 29th day of May, 1453, the impossible became reality. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare, religious prophecy, and the end of the ancient world. Stay with us until the end, because this story holds secrets that echo through history to this very day. First, the empire's final days. The winter of 1452 turned to spring, and Constantinople awoke to a nightmare. From the palace windows, Emperor Constantine XI could see the horizon filling with enemy tents. Day after day, more soldiers arrived. The Ottoman army was gathering like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable. Constantine was 58 years old, a soldier emperor who had spent his life defending what remained of Rome's glory. He ruled an empire that existed mostly in name and memory. Once Byzantine lands stretched from Spain to Syria, from the Danube to the deserts of North Africa. Now the empire consisted of little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. The emperor's domain had shrunk to the walls that surrounded him. But what walls they were! Constantinople's defenses were legendary, built by Emperor Theodosius II nearly 1,000 years earlier. The outer wall stood 40 feet high and 16 feet thick. Behind it rose a second wall, even taller at 60 feet. Between these walls ran a terrace where defenders could rain death upon any attacker. Beyond the outer wall stretched a moat 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep. This triple barrier had never been breached by force. The city sat on a triangle of land, protected by water on two sides. To the south flowed the Sea of Marmara, its currents too strong for easy naval assault. To the northeast stretched the Golden Horn, a natural harbor that Constantinople's defenders had closed off with a massive chain. This chain, forged from iron links as thick as a man's arm, stretched across the harbor's mouth from the city walls to the Galata Tower on the opposite shore. No ship could enter the Golden Horn without Byzantine permission. Only from the west could an army approach on land. Here, across the Lycus River valley, stretched 4 miles of walls facing the plains of Thrace. This was where Constantine concentrated his forces, knowing that any attack must come from this direction. But even here, the defenses seemed impregnable. Triple walls, defended moats, strategic towers every 50 yards. Generations of invaders had broken themselves against these fortifications. Yet Constantine could not sleep. He walked the walls at night, inspecting defenses, talking to his soldiers, searching for weaknesses. He knew something that terrified him. The empire was hollow. Behind the mighty walls lived perhaps 50,000 souls, where once 1 million had dwelt. The great forums stood empty. Entire districts had been abandoned, their buildings crumbling into ruins. Grass grew in streets where emperors had once paraded in triumph. The emperor's army numbered less than 7,000 men. Of these, only about 2,000 were professional soldiers. The rest were citizens, merchants, artisans, and monks who had taken up arms to defend their homes. Against them marched an Ottoman force that scouts estimated at over 80,000 warriors, with more arriving daily. Constantine sent desperate messages to the Christian kingdoms of Europe. He begged for help from the Pope in Rome, from the kings of France and Aragon, from the Doge of Venice. Some aid trickled in. The Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with 700 professional soldiers, expert in siege warfare. Venetian sailors manned some of the warships that guarded the harbor. But no great crusade came to save the city. Europe was divided, suspicious, and far away. In the Ottoman camp, Sultan Mehmed II prepared for glory. At 21 years old, he was young, brilliant, and consumed by a single obsession. Constantinople must fall. It must become his capital, the jewel of his empire, the proof of his divine mandate to rule. His father Murad had besieged the city and failed. Every Ottoman sultan had dreamed of conquering Constantinople. Mehmed would succeed where all others had failed or die in the attempt. Mehmed was no ordinary warrior king. He spoke 6 languages. He studied geometry, astronomy, and philosophy. He read histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, seeking to understand how great conquerors achieved the impossible. And he understood that Constantinople's walls, though mighty, were not invincible. They had been built for an earlier age, designed to withstand catapults and battering rams, not the new weapons of gunpowder warfare. The Sultan had hired a Hungarian engineer named Urban, a master cannon founder who promised to build guns that could shatter any wall ever made. Urban had offered his services to Constantine first, but the Byzantine emperor had no money to pay him. Mehmed gave Urban everything he requested: unlimited bronze for casting, teams of craftsmen, wagons for transport, oxen to pull the massive weapons. Money was no object. The Sultan's treasury funded an arms race that Constantinople could not hope to match. Through the winter, Urban worked at his foundry in Adrianople, 70 miles from Constantinople. There, he cast the largest cannon the world had ever seen. The monster gun measured 27 feet long. Its barrel was 8 inches thick. It could fire a stone ball weighing over half a ton. The sound of its discharge could be heard 10 miles away. When Urban tested it, the stone ball flew over a mile before smashing into the earth, creating a crater 6 feet deep. But this super cannon was just the largest of many. Mehmed assembled a siege train of over 70 guns, from small anti-personnel weapons to massive wall breakers. He hired specialists who understood the new science of artillery, men who could calculate trajectories, mix the right proportions of saltpeter and charcoal, and coordinate devastating bombardments. In early April, the first Ottoman troops began to arrive outside Constantinople. They came from every corner of Mehmed's expanding empire. Anatolian cavalry, fierce horsemen who had conquered the Turkish heartland, Balkan infantry, including many Christian soldiers forced to serve their Ottoman overlords, Arab engineers skilled in siege warfare, Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, Christian boys taken from their families as children, converted to Islam and trained as fanatical warriors loyal only to the Sultan. The Janissaries were Mehmed's most fearsome troops. They lived in barracks, forbidden to marry, devoted entirely to war. They trained constantly with sword, bow, and musket. They marched in perfect formation, responding instantly to their officers' commands. In battle, they never retreated without orders. To turn back was death. To advance, glory and plunder. They wore distinctive white felt caps and carried curved scimitars that could split a helmet with one blow. Can you imagine the terror in Constantinople as this massive army took position? Day after day, more tents appeared, more campfires lit the night, more war drums echoed across the land walls. The citizens watched from the ramparts, counting enemy banners, trying to estimate their chances. Some prayed in churches, some fled to ships in the harbor, hoping to escape before the siege closed all exits. Most stayed, trusting in walls that had never failed, in God who had always protected the city. Constantine ordered a census of his defenders. The count was grimmer than he feared. He could muster about 7,000 fighting men to defend 4 miles of land walls, plus the sea walls along the Golden Horn and the Marmara coast. Stretched thin, the defenders would have barely 1 man for every yard of wall. Against them, Mehmed could rotate fresh troops constantly, attacking day and night, giving the exhausted defenders no rest. The emperor divided his meager forces strategically. He took personal command of the central section, the weakest point where the Lycus River Valley created a dip in the land, forcing the walls to run through lower ground. Giovanni Giustiniani and his Genoese professionals would hold this crucial sector with Constantine. The Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro would later write that these 700 Genoese were worth more than all the other defenders combined, so skilled were they in the arts of war. Other sections went to various commanders. The brothers Bocchiardi, Genoese captains, took the northern stretch. Minotto, the Venetian bailo, commanded troops near the Blachernae Palace. Theophilus Palaeologus, the emperor's cousin, defended the harbor walls. Each section had its own flag, its own commander, its own desperate hope of holding back the coming storm. On the 2nd day of April, Mehmed himself arrived. He rode at the head of his personal guard, magnificent in armor, inlaid with gold, mounted on a white Arabian horse. The Sultan was small in stature but radiated confidence and energy. He immediately began inspecting his siege lines, conferring with engineers, positioning his artillery. Nothing was left to chance. Every gun had its assigned target. Every assault unit knew its objective. Mehmed planned this siege like a chess master, thinking 10 moves ahead. The Sultan established his red and gold tent directly opposite the Lycus Valley, the weakest point in Constantinople's defenses. From here, he could personally oversee the main assault. His most powerful cannons were positioned here. His best troops, the Janissaries, camped here. Urban's monster gun was slowly making its way from Adrianople, pulled by 60 oxen and supported by 700 men. It would soon take its place in the battery aimed at the central walls. Before the bombardment began, Mehmed made one final offer. He sent an envoy to Constantine under flag of truce. The message was simple: surrender the city, and all would be spared. Constantine and his court could depart in peace with all their possessions. The citizens would be protected. No harm would come to churches or homes, but if the city resisted, the laws of war were clear. A city taken by storm could be plundered for 3 days. Everything, everyone, would belong to the conquerors. Constantine's reply was equally simple. He would never surrender the city that God had entrusted to him. He was Roman emperor. Constantinople was the new Rome, the continuation of an empire founded by Augustus, sanctified by Constantine the Great, who made it the Christian capital. To surrender it would be to betray everything his ancestors had fought to preserve. The city would stand or fall with him in it. What happened next would echo through the centuries. On the 5th day of April, 1453, the Ottoman cannons spoke for the first time. The earth shook. Windows shattered across Constantinople. People fell to their knees, thinking it was an earthquake. But it was not the earth moving. It was the sound of Urban's monster cannon firing its first shot. The massive stone ball arced through the sky, screaming like a demon, and smashed into the outer wall near the gate of St. Romanus. The impact shook the entire fortification. Stone exploded in every direction. When the dust cleared, a crack ran through the wall like lightning. Then the other cannons joined in, 70 guns, firing in coordinated salvos, pounding the walls hour after hour. The smaller cannons could fire several times an hour. The medium guns fired once an hour. Urban's monster required 3 hours to cool, clean, load, and fire again. But each shot did devastating damage. By nightfall of the first day, sections of the outer wall had already begun to crumble. Inside the city, panic spread. No one had imagined bombardment on this scale. The noise was constant, terrifying, overwhelming. Mothers clutched children, priests led prayers. Constantine ordered all available men to the walls carrying stones, timber, barrels of earth, anything that could repair the breaches. Every night, after the guns fell silent, Byzantine workers risked their lives to rebuild what the day's bombardment had destroyed. A pattern emerged. The Ottomans would bombard a section of wall all day. That night, the defenders would frantically repair the damage, working by torchlight. At dawn, the guns would resume, destroying the night's work. It was a race between cannon and human determination, gunpowder and sweat. But the walls were not Constantinople's only worry. Mehmed had also assembled a fleet. Warships and transport vessels, over 300 ships in all, filled the waters of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. These ships could not enter the Golden Horn because of the Great Chain, but they prevented any relief force from reaching the city by sea. Byzantine and allied ships controlled the harbor, but they were trapped there, unable to challenge the larger Ottoman fleet in open water. On the 9th day of April, Mehmed decided to test the chain. He ordered his admiral Baltaoglu to attack the harbor entrance with the Ottoman fleet's heaviest warships. Perhaps the chain could be broken. Perhaps the Byzantine ships defending it could be overwhelmed. If Ottoman vessels could enter the Golden Horn, the entire defense of the city would collapse. Constantinople's harbor walls were lower and weaker than the land walls, never designed to withstand a determined assault. They could only hold if the chain kept enemy ships out. The Ottoman fleet advanced. Byzantine ships met them at the harbor mouth. All day, a desperate naval battle raged. Greek fire, that mysterious Byzantine weapon that burned on water, was hurled at Ottoman vessels. Several caught fire and sank, their crews screaming as the flames consumed them. Venetian crossbowmen picked off Turkish sailors. A Genoese captain rammed an Ottoman galley, sinking it in minutes. As sunset approached, Baltaoglu had to admit defeat. The chain held. The Byzantine ships, though outnumbered, fought with desperate skill. The Ottoman fleet withdrew, having lost several ships and gained nothing. Mehmed was furious. He considered executing Baltaoglu for failure, but his advisors counseled patience. The land assault was what mattered. The fleet could wait. Meanwhile, the bombardment of the land walls continued relentlessly. By the middle of April, significant breaches had opened in the outer wall at several points, but here, Constantinople's defensive genius became apparent. The double wall system meant that even when the outer wall fell, defenders could retreat to the higher inner wall. From there, they could rain arrows, stones, and Greek fire down on anyone trying to cross the debris-filled space between the walls. Moreover, the Byzantine defenders proved remarkably skilled at repairing damage. They developed techniques to absorb cannon impact. They hung leather hides filled with wool over vulnerable sections to cushion the blows. They built makeshift walls behind the breaches, using barrels filled with earth and stones. When sections collapsed completely, they constructed wooden palisades and earthen ramparts in the gaps. Every night was a construction project, a desperate race against the dawn and the resumption of bombardment. Constantine himself worked alongside his men. The emperor carried stones, helped position timber, encouraged the exhausted workers. Byzantine sources record that he slept only 2 or 3 hours a night, spending every moment organizing the defense, inspecting weak points, ensuring supplies reached each section of wall. His presence inspired the defenders. If their emperor would not abandon them, they would not abandon the walls. But everyone knew the truth. This could not continue forever. The defenders were exhausted, supplies were finite. The walls, however mighty, were slowly being ground to rubble. Unless help arrived from the Christian West, unless some miracle occurred, the end was only a matter of time. The question was not if Constantinople would fall, but when and what price the Ottomans would pay in blood before the city yielded its final secret. Second, the siege begins. On the 20th day of April, a sight appeared on the horizon that lifted every heart in Constantinople. 4 ships were sailing toward the city. 3 were Genoese vessels sent by the Pope, carrying supplies and reinforcements. The 4th was a large Byzantine transport ship returning from Sicily with a cargo of grain desperately needed by the besieged population. These 4 ships represented hope. They carried food, weapons, and several hundred fresh soldiers. More importantly, they proved that the city was not completely isolated. The maritime routes remained open. Perhaps this was the beginning of a relief effort. Perhaps the Christian powers of Europe were finally responding to Constantinople's pleas for help. But between these ships and safety lay the entire Ottoman fleet. Over 300 vessels blocked the Bosphorus and the approaches to the Golden Horn. Mehmed ordered Baltaoglu to intercept the Christian ships at all costs. The Sultan understood the psychological impact. If these ships reached Constantinople, the defenders' morale would soar. If they were captured, despair would settle over the city. The wind was blowing from the south, perfect for the Christian ships to sail toward Constantinople. The Ottoman fleet rowed out to meet them. What followed was one of the most dramatic naval engagements of the entire siege. Tens of thousands of people lined the shores to watch. On Constantinople's walls, defenders prayed and cheered. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed himself rowed to the shore to observe, furious that 4 ships might slip through his blockade. The Christian ships were tall, built for ocean voyaging, with high sides and strong hulls. The Ottoman vessels were mostly galleys, low and fast, but vulnerable to ramming from above. As the fleets met, the Ottoman ships swarmed around the 4 Christian vessels like wolves around bears, but the bears had teeth. Crossbow bolts rained down from the Christian decks. Greek fire poured onto Ottoman galleys that came too close. The Genoese captains used their height advantage brilliantly, positioning their ships so that Ottoman vessels could not come alongside without being crushed or burned. For hours, the battle raged in sight of both armies and the entire population of Constantinople. Then disaster struck. The south wind that had carried the Christian ships suddenly died. The 4 vessels lost momentum, their sails hanging limp. They began to drift, helpless in the current. The Ottoman galleys closed in, sensing victory. Hundreds of Turkish soldiers prepared to board. Baltaoglu urged his rowers forward, determined to redeem his earlier failure. On Constantinople's walls, the mood turned from hope to horror. The ships were so close, barely half a mile from safety. But without wind, they were doomed. Priests led prayers, women wept. Soldiers could only watch helplessly as the Ottoman noose tightened. Mehmed rode his horse into the shallow water, screaming orders to his fleet. He wanted those ships taken. He wanted the Christian sailors captured and executed in sight of Constantinople's walls. His fury was volcanic. Baltaoglu had promised victory. The Sultan would accept nothing less. But just as the Ottoman soldiers prepared to board, the wind returned. Not the gentle south breeze, but a powerful north wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The Christian sails filled. The four ships surged forward, their momentum carrying them through the mass of Ottoman galleys. Smaller vessels were smashed aside or capsized. The Genoese captains steered for the Golden Horn with perfect skill. Can you imagine the roar from Constantinople's walls? The entire city erupted in jubilation. Church bells rang. People danced in the streets. The ships had survived against impossible odds. They reached the chain barrier. Byzantine sailors quickly lowered it. The four vessels sailed into the Golden Horn to thunderous cheers. Behind them, the chain rose again, sealing the harbor against pursuit. Mehmed was beside himself with rage. He summoned Baltoglu and stripped him of his rank on the spot. Only the pleas of his advisors saved the admiral from execution. Instead, Mehmed ordered him bastinadoed, beaten on the soles of his feet until he could barely walk. The Sultan then confiscated all of Baltoglu's property and banished him from court in disgrace. But the Sultan's anger soon turned to determination. If he could not force the chain, he would bypass it. On the night of the 22nd of April, Mehmed unveiled a plan so audacious that even his own commanders thought it impossible. He would move his fleet overland around the Galata Heights and launch them into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The engineer said it could not be done. The distance was over a mile, much of it uphill. How could you move heavy warships over land? Mehmed showed them how. He ordered a road built, greased with animal fat and soap. Wooden rollers were prepared. Teams of oxen and thousands of soldiers would pull the ships. On the night of the 22nd, the operation began. Under cover of darkness, Ottoman workers greased the roadway. At dawn, the defenders of Constantinople woke to an impossible sight. Turkish ships were sailing over the hills behind Galata. More than 70 vessels made the journey. Galleys, transports, and supply ships were dragged up one side of the hill and down the other. Bands played triumphant music to celebrate this engineering marvel. Mehmed had achieved the impossible. By sunset, a new Ottoman fleet floated in the Golden Horn. The defenders were stunned. Their protected harbor was no longer safe. Now they had to defend the weak harbor walls against potential attack. Constantine had to divert precious troops from the land walls to guard against this new threat. The Venetians and Genoese argued bitterly about whose fault this was. Some blamed the Genoese colony of Galata for allowing the Ottomans to use their territory. Others blamed their own failure to burn the Ottoman fleet when they had the chance. The Sultan's next move was equally ingenious. He ordered a pontoon bridge built across the Golden Horn, allowing his troops to move quickly from one side to the other. This bridge also enabled his men to attack the harbor walls from platforms built on the pontoons. The defenders watched in dismay as the siege tightened around them like a noose. Meanwhile, the bombardment of the land walls intensified. Urban's monster cannon proved to be both a blessing and a curse for the Ottomans. Each shot did tremendous damage, but the gun was fragile. The intense heat of firing cracked the barrel. After several shots, the massive weapon split apart, unusable. Urban himself was killed, struck by flying debris when another of his large cannons exploded. But Mehmed had other guns, and the bombardment continued. By early May, the outer wall at the Lycus Valley had been reduced to rubble in several places. The defenders packed the breaches with everything available: barrels of earth, stones from ruined buildings, timber from demolished houses, even overturned wagons and furniture. Behind these improvised barriers, exhausted soldiers waited for the assaults they knew were coming. Mehmed decided it was time to test the breaches with a direct assault. On the 7th day of May, he ordered a general attack along the entire length of the land walls. This was not the final assault, but a probing attack designed to find weak points and wear down the defenders. The attack began at dawn. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers, mostly irregular troops, rushed toward the walls. They carried ladders, grappling hooks and shields. Their job was simple: reach the walls, scale them if possible, and force the defenders to exhaust themselves in combat. These soldiers were expendable, the poorest troops in Mehmed's army. They knew that death likely awaited them, but also that any who reached the walls first might win great plunder. The defenders met them with everything they had. Arrows darkened the sky. Crossbow bolts struck down men by the hundreds. Defenders hurled stones, poured boiling oil, and threw Greek fire. At the breaches, hand-to-hand combat erupted as Ottoman soldiers scrambled over the rubble, and Byzantine defenders met them with swords and axes. For hours, the battle raged. The Ottoman irregulars showed courage, but lacked coordination. They attacked in waves, but without proper support from the regular army. The defenders, though exhausted, fought with the fury of men protecting their homes and families. Giovanni Giustiniani was everywhere, his armor splashed with blood, rallying his Genoese soldiers, personally joining the combat at critical moments. By afternoon, Mehmed called off the assault. His irregulars had done their job. They had tested the defenses, identified weak points, and forced the defenders to expend arrows, bolts, and Greek fire. The casualties meant nothing to the Sultan. He had tens of thousands more soldiers, but now he knew where the walls were weakest, where the defenders were thinnest. The real assault would come later. Inside Constantinople, the mood darkened. The defenders had won this battle, but barely. Casualties were mounting. The Genoese captain Maurizio Cataneo had been killed, a terrible loss of an experienced officer. Ammunition stocks were running low. Greek fire was almost exhausted. The citizens were hungry, surviving on reduced rations as food supplies dwindled. Constantine called a council of his commanders. The debate was heated. Some argued for a desperate sortie, a surprise attack on the Ottoman camp to destroy the guns. Others counseled patience, trusting in the walls and hoping for relief from the west. The Venetians proposed using their ships to break through the Ottoman fleet and bring help. Every plan had risks. Every option seemed hopeless. The emperor made his decision. They would defend every inch of wall to the last man. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no abandon the city to save themselves. Constantine was Roman emperor. His duty was clear. He would stand with his people and trust in God's providence. But even as the emperor spoke these brave words, everyone in the room understood the mathematics of siege warfare. The defenders numbered less than 7,000. They had lost hundreds already. Food was running low. Ammunition was depleting. The walls were crumbling despite desperate repairs. Against them stood an army of 80,000, with unlimited supplies, fresh troops, and the Sultan's iron determination. Mehmed knew it too. He intensified the bombardment, ordering his guns to fire day and night. The constant noise was itself a weapon, preventing sleep, breaking down the defenders' mental resistance. Every few hours, Ottoman drums would sound, and thousands of soldiers would rush toward the walls, forcing the exhausted defenders to man the ramparts. These were not serious attacks, just harassment to prevent rest. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Mehmed wanted the defenders demoralized, exhausted, ready to break. He sent envoys with new surrender offers. Give up the city, and you may leave in peace. Constantine always refused. The emperor had made his choice. Constantinople would stand or fall as a Christian city. There would be no negotiation. On the 16th day of May, Mehmed tried a different approach. His engineers had been digging tunnels, attempting to burrow under the walls and collapse them from below. Byzantine defenders, aided by a Scottish engineer named Grant, who was expert in countermining, had detected most of these tunnels and destroyed them. But one tunnel came dangerously close to success. Grant and his miners worked frantically to intercept this Ottoman tunnel. They dug their own counter-tunnel, broke through into the Turkish excavation and flooded it with Greek fire. The trapped Ottoman miners died screaming. Grant himself was killed in the fighting underground. His loss was devastating. Without his expertise, could the defenders detect and stop future mining attempts? The Sultan also built siege towers, massive wooden structures taller than the walls, protected with leather hides soaked in water to resist Greek fire. These towers were rolled toward the walls on the night of the 18th of May. From their tops, Ottoman archers could shoot down at the defenders, while soldiers hidden inside could storm onto the walls when the towers reached them. But the defenders responded brilliantly. They concentrated all their remaining gunpowder weapons on these towers. Cannon fire shattered their bases. Greek fire set them ablaze despite the wet leather coverings. By dawn, the towers were smoking ruins. Another Ottoman tactic had failed, yet each victory cost the defenders dearly. Ammunition that could never be replaced was expended. Men were killed or wounded who could not be substituted. The walls suffered damage that each night became harder to repair. The defenders were running out of time, out of supplies, out of hope. What if help never came? What if the Christian West had abandoned Constantinople to its fate? What if the next assault was the final one? These questions haunted every defender as May wore on and the noose continued to tighten. Third, the last stand. By the 25th day of May, Mehmed II decided the time had come. His advisors counseled patience. The city was slowly starving. The walls were crumbling. Why risk a costly assault when time was on the Ottoman side? But the Sultan refused to wait any longer. He had been besieging Constantinople for 7 weeks. His own army was growing restless. Some of his commanders whispered that perhaps the city was truly impregnable, protected by divine power as the legends claimed. Mehmed called a council of war. He announced that the final assault would come in 3 days, on the 29th of May. Every commander received specific orders. The irregular troops would attack first, in waves, exhausting the defenders. Then, the Anatolian regulars would assault the breaches. Finally, the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, would deliver the killing blow. The attack would begin before dawn and continue without pause until the city fell. The Sultan offered one final incentive. The soldier who first scaled the walls would receive immense rewards, wealth, land, and the rank of Pasha. But more than this, Mehmed invoked Islamic teaching about Constantinople. The Prophet Muhammad himself had prophesied that one day a Muslim army would conquer the city. The commander who achieved this would be blessed above all others. What greater glory could a warrior seek than to fulfill prophecy? On the 27th of May, an ominous sign appeared. A full lunar eclipse turned the moon blood red, exactly as ancient prophecies had predicted would occur before Constantinople's fall. Even the defenders who had scoffed at prophecy felt a chill. The citizens watched the darkened moon and whispered that the end had come. Some Greeks remembered old legends that the city would stand until a Constantine ruled, and it would fall to another Constantine, under a blood moon. Emperor Constantine XI now ruled. Was this the Constantine of prophecy? The emperor refused to accept defeat based on superstition. On the night of the 28th of May, he ordered a final religious procession through the city. Every icon was carried through the streets. Priests chanted prayers. The entire population participated, even those who had argued bitterly about religious doctrine in the past. Orthodox Greeks marched beside Catholic Venetians. Genoese fought side by side with bitter rivals. In the face of annihilation, all divisions were forgotten. Constantine addressed his troops that final night. He spoke of Rome's glory, of 1,000 years of Christian civilization, of duty and honor. He reminded them that they defended not just stone and mortar, but the legacy of Constantine the Great, the wisdom of Justinian, the courage of Heraclius. They were the last guardians of an empire that had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, that had stood as a bulwark against countless invasions. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would be remembered forever. The emperor's final words were recorded by several witnesses. He said that any man who wished to leave should do so now. The ships in the harbor could take some to safety. There would be no shame in departing, but those who stayed must know the truth. They would likely die tomorrow, yet they would die as free men defending their homes, faithful to their God and their emperor. He asked only one thing: that they fight with courage, that they make the Ottomans pay dearly for every inch of ground, that if Constantinople must fall, it would fall in a manner worthy of its glorious history. Not a single man left. Every defender, knowing death awaited, chose to stay. What else could they do? These were their homes, their families, their churches. To abandon them was unthinkable. Better to die on the walls than live with the shame of cowardice. As midnight passed and the 29th of May began, an eerie silence fell over both camps. The Ottoman guns had stopped firing. No drums beat, no trumpet sounded. In the darkness, 80,000 Ottoman soldiers prepared themselves. They checked weapons, said prayers, thought of the plunder that awaited them if they survived the coming battle. In 3 hours, they would assault walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Most knew they would die in the attempt, but glory and paradise awaited the faithful. On the walls, 7,000 exhausted defenders took their positions. They had not slept in days. Food was scarce. Ammunition was nearly gone. Many were wounded, fighting through pain and blood loss, but they stood ready. Constantine walked the walls one final time, stopping to speak with small groups of soldiers, offering encouragement, checking that everyone understood their posts. At 1 in the morning, the attack began. Not with trumpet fanfare, but with a sound like thunder. Every Ottoman gun fired simultaneously. The bombardment was more intense than anything before. Stone balls weighing half a ton smashed into the walls. Smaller guns fired grapeshot to clear the ramparts. The noise was apocalyptic, a continuous roar that made the earth shake. Under cover of this bombardment, the irregular troops advanced. These were the Bashi Bazouks, wild warriors from the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire. They were poorly armed and barely trained, but ferocious in attack. Thousands rushed toward the walls, screaming battle cries, firing arrows and crude firearms, carrying scaling ladders. The defenders met them with everything remaining: arrows, crossbow bolts, stones hurled by hand, burning projectiles, even loose bricks pried from crumbling sections of wall. The slaughter was terrible. Ottoman soldiers fell in heaps before the walls, but more kept coming, wave after wave, climbing over the bodies of the dead, desperate to be among the first to breach the defenses. For 2 hours, this phase of the assault continued. The Bashi Bazouks achieved nothing except to exhaust the defenders and fill the moat with corpses. But that was their purpose. They were expendable, meant to tire the enemy and use up ammunition. Mehmed watched from his command post, coldly calculating the mathematics of attrition. When the irregulars finally withdrew, littering the ground with their dead and dying, there was barely time to breathe before the second wave attacked. These were the Anatolian regulars, professional soldiers of the Sultan's provincial armies. They were better armed, better disciplined, and supported by concentrated artillery fire on specific breach points. The Anatolians focused their assault on the weakest sections of wall, particularly the Lycus Valley, where the fortifications ran through low ground. Here, weeks of bombardment had reduced parts of the outer wall to rubble. The Anatolians scrambled over this rubble, fought through the killing zone between the walls, and attempted to scale the inner wall. Vicious hand-to-hand combat erupted. Ottoman soldiers who reached the top of the inner wall were met by Genoese professionals and Byzantine veterans fighting with swords, axes, and pure desperation. Blood soaked the ramparts. Men screamed and died. The wounded fell from the walls to be crushed by the surging masses below. Giovanni Giustiniani was a whirlwind of destruction. The Genoese captain fought at the front of every melee, his sword rising and falling, his voice rallying his men. Where he appeared, the line held. His 700 Genoese were worth an army, so fierce was their resistance. Time and again, Ottoman soldiers gained the wall top, only to be driven back by Giustiniani and his veterans. But even the strongest warrior has limits. Around dawn, as the sky began to lighten, a small cannonball struck Giustiniani. It penetrated his armor below the shoulder, a terrible wound that splintered bone and tore flesh. The captain fell, bleeding heavily. His men rushed to his aid, carrying him from the walls toward a ship in the harbor where a surgeon waited. The impact of this moment cannot be overstated. Giustiniani's fall sent shockwaves through the defense. Constantine himself rushed to the breach, begging the Genoese captain not to leave, promising doctors anything. But Giustiniani was in agony, perhaps dying. His men insisted on taking him to the ships. They opened a small gate in the inner wall to carry him through. This gate should have been immediately secured, but in the chaos and confusion, someone failed to close it properly. Ottoman scouts saw the open gate. They saw Greek defenders abandoning their posts to help carry Giustiniani. They saw a chance. At almost the same moment, Mehmed unleashed his final reserve. The Janissaries, who had been waiting in perfect formation, received the order to attack. 5,000 of the Sultan's best warriors surged forward. They wore distinctive uniforms, carried the best weapons, and moved with the precision of a machine. Their drums beat a terrifying rhythm. Their war cries echoed across the battlefield. The Janissaries hit the walls like a human avalanche. They poured through the breaches, scaled the rubble, and concentrated on the exact points where the defenses were weakest. And they found that small, improperly secured gate near where Giustiniani had fallen. A small group of Janissaries, perhaps 50 men, slipped through this gate into the space between the inner and outer walls. From there, they could attack the inner wall defenders from behind. Panic began to spread among the exhausted Greeks and Italians. Enemy soldiers were inside the walls. How many? Where had they come from? In the confusion, some defenders abandoned their posts. Others rushed to confront the Janissaries who had penetrated the defenses. Constantine, seeing the defense beginning to crumble, made a decision that sealed his fate. He discarded his imperial regalia so he would not be recognized. He drew his sword and led a small group of loyal followers in a desperate counterattack. The Emperor of the Romans, descendant of Augustus Caesar, became a simple soldier in the final moments of his empire's existence. No one knows exactly how Constantine died. Some accounts say he fell fighting at a breach in the wall, surrounded by enemies, going down with sword in hand. Others claim he was killed near the gate of St. Romanus, trying to rally fleeing defenders. Byzantine sources say he cried out, "The city has fallen and I still live," and then threw himself into the thickest fighting, seeking death rather than captivity. What is certain is that by mid-morning, on the 29th of May, 1453, Constantine XI was dead, the last Roman emperor, and Constantinople had fallen. The Janissaries raised Ottoman banners on the walls. More and more Turkish soldiers poured through the breaches and gates. The defense collapsed. Some defenders retreated to the ships and managed to escape. Others died fighting in the streets. Many civilians sought refuge in churches, praying for a miracle that never came. Mehmed's soldiers flooded into the city. By the laws of war in that era, a city taken by storm could be pillaged for 3 days. The sack of Constantinople was terrible. Soldiers ransacked homes seeking gold and valuables. Libraries were burned. Priceless art was destroyed or stolen. Citizens were killed or enslaved. Churches were desecrated. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent cathedral in Christendom, was filled with refugees when the Ottomans broke down its doors. The scene inside was chaos. Families huddled together praying for salvation. When Turkish soldiers entered, many were taken as slaves. The church itself was spared from destruction. Mehmed had given specific orders that the building was not to be damaged. He intended to convert it into a mosque, the crown jewel of his new capital. By afternoon, Mehmed himself entered the city. He rode through streets littered with bodies and debris, surveying his conquest. When he reached Hagia Sophia, he dismounted and entered the great cathedral. A Muslim soldier was smashing floor tiles, seeking hidden treasure. Mehmed struck the man with his sword, declaring that the building was now his property and no one should damage it further. The Sultan ordered an imam to climb the pulpit and call the faithful to prayer. For the first time in 900 years, Islamic prayers echoed through Hagia Sophia. The building that had been the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity was now a mosque. The transformation was symbolic. Constantinople, the queen of cities, was now Istanbul, capital of an Islamic empire that would dominate the region for centuries. The pillage continued for 3 days as law allowed. Then Mehmed ordered it stopped. He wanted to restore the city, not destroy it. He needed Constantinople intact as his capital. Surviving citizens were encouraged to return. Greek merchants were given trading privileges. The Orthodox Patriarch was confirmed in his religious authority over Christian subjects. Mehmed understood that he ruled not just Turks, but Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others. He needed these communities functional, not devastated. But the empire was dead. The Byzantine Empire, which had ruled for over 1,000 years, which had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, which had been the greatest power in Europe for centuries, was gone. Its last emperor died on the walls he defended. Its capital became the heart of a new empire. An age had ended. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe. When news reached Rome, the Pope wept. When it reached Venice, the city went into mourning. When it reached the kingdoms of the West, people spoke in hushed tones of the end of the world. The unthinkable had happened. The new Rome had fallen. The last remnant of the ancient Roman Empire had been erased. But from this catastrophe came unexpected consequences. Greek scholars fled Constantinople carrying precious manuscripts. They went to Italy, where their knowledge helped spark the Renaissance. The old trade routes through Constantinople were now controlled by the Ottomans, forcing European powers to seek new paths to Asia. This search would lead to the Age of Exploration, to Columbus seeking a western route to India, to Vasco da Gama sailing around Africa. The fall of Constantinople changed the world. It marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of modernity. It shifted power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic powers. It sparked religious and cultural transformations across Europe. And it provided a lesson that echoes through history. No matter how mighty, no empire lasts forever. All walls eventually fall. All cities have their final day. And so today, we discovered that the fall of Constantinople was not just the death of a city, but the end of an entire world. In 53 days of siege, 1,000 years of history came crashing down. Personally, I believe that Constantine XI represents something profound about human courage. He could have fled, he could have surrendered. Instead, he chose to stand with his people and die as an emperor should. That choice defines heroism. What do you think? Do you believe that Constantine made the right decision? Would you have stayed to defend the walls or sought safety for yourself and your family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And which ancient empire should we explore next? The Romans, the Persians, the Mongols? Tell us what historical story you want to hear. If you enjoyed this epic journey through one of history's most dramatic moments, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to Pages from History and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration of the ancient world. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.